Hello students, good morning to all. I'm Muhammad Naeem Amin Bhatti and today the topic of our discussion is Alfred Tennyson as an early Victorian poet. There are Victorian poets on your screen, and they are three in numbers, and there are also minor poets, two of the minor poets. But today, from these three poets, we will discuss only the one, Alfred Tennyson. The other poets are Robert Browning and Matthew Arnold, who was a born critic and poet also. Robert Browning was a poet, and Alfred Tennyson is most recognized early Victorian poet. Now we discuss the characteristics of Victorian poetry because to understand any poet or his poetical works or her poetical works, we have to discuss the characteristics of that age in which the poet was writing, in which the particular piece of writing was published. So, here we are to discuss the characteristics of Victorian poetry. Victorian poetry was less subjective, which means that there were information but was not in depth or in detail, because the detailed informations always leads towards the excessive poetical material in that poetical work. But the poetry at that time in the early Victorian age was less subjective, that provides the necessary information but wasn't concerned with that type of the explanations which were unnecessarily long. So that's why we can say that the Victorian poetry was less subjective. And the second point of the characteristics of Victorian poetry is the interest in the past. The Victorian poets always relate their topics towards the past events which were passed in the previous 60 odd years, 70 odd years, or in the previous century. That's why the Victorian poetry can be coincided with the past events. And the poet always concerned with past events rather than the present. It doesn't mean that he never describes the present event, but it means that he always correlates or interrelates the past events, and there is always an interesting parameter with the past and present events. The next one is the use of dramatic monologue. The dramatic monologue was used by, chiefly it was used by the Browning, because Browning was the master of dramatic monologue. But Tennyson also used that dramatic monologue, and what the dramatic monologue is, it is actually a character talking to himself or herself, and he thinks that there is nobody around him or her, and he always depicts his thoughts and understanding by talking about that type. And in monologue, mono means one and log means to talk about, and in that monologue a person is always a sole person, a single person talking about something related to his understanding, his thoughts, or any topic which comes to his or her minds. Themes were realistic, that is always touching to the realism, which is the basic characteristic of the Victorian age. As the child labor, for example, the theme could be child labor or any social event of any social evil of that time. And the second most major theme of that age was the science, as you know that the knowledge which gives us the understanding of this world is called science. So, science is always a major theme in each and every age. But here in the Victorian poetry, and particularly in the earlier Victorian poetry, there is a conflictive, comparative, and contrasting uh, analysis of the religion and science. There is always a comparative and contrasting subjugation and the subject matters related to the science and religion. and of course the rights of women, etc. were the theme. Now, particularly the not the rights of the women, but rights of each and every individual who was concerned with the humanism, who was concerned with that age or this world. Like it could be a rights of the men also, it could be rights of the children, but comparatively the rights of the women were focused upon at that time. There is always a pictorial depiction. They basically the Victorian poets always heavily rely on the visual imagery, means the things which are created through the words in the very eyes of the readers. I mean, while reading the Victorian poetry, the reader could enjoy the different types of the scenery going through from his or her minds by reading those words. And the doubt and psychological conflicts, it is always a major theme, because there is always a contrast and comparison between the bad beliefs and the good beliefs, the faith and the doubt. And side by side, it touches to the psychological conflicts of the individuals, the psychological conflicts of the parties, the psychological conflicts of the social societies of that time. So that's why the Victorian poetry was pretty much concerned with the psychological conflicts between the protagonist and antagonist, psychological conflicts of different characters presented in that poetical work, and also the psychological conflict in an individual between his thoughts and between his actions, between what he is going to do and what he is not going to do, and between what haves and have nots. And similarly, the last one is Elegy. It is a mourning poem, a poem which tells us about the loss or the death, the tragical events or the destructive events. And through this song type poem, we always talk about that particular destruction, that tragedy, that loss, and we mourn upon it. So, let us now talk about our poet of early Victorian age. Alfred Tennyson was born on August 6, 1809 in Somersby, Lincolnshire, England. Tennyson's father was a church rector, and he earned a decent amount of money for the livelihood of the children, to brought up his children. And Tennyson, you can see that, was taking interest at that time of the poetry. Tennyson attended the Louth Grammar School, and you can imagine that a student having that age, a school-going student, was penning his own poems at that time. Isn't it interesting that at the age of 8, Tennyson was penning his first poems? In 1827, he began to study at Trinity College, Cambridge University. And the student at that time, as a student at that time, Tennyson thought that there would be a great deal of subject matters if he brings the diversity in his poetry. So he did. He brought up some type of diversity in his poetry. Tennyson has a credit that he is the most recognized representative poet of the Victorian age. I mean, when there is a talk about the Victorian age, when there is a discussion about the Victorian age, so deliberately a name comes into your mind is always a Tennyson. And his poetry is a record of the intellectual and spiritual life of that time. Intellectual means something that concern with the intellect of a person, the wisdom of a person, but the spirituality is something else. Spirituality is always a negation to the materialism. It is always opposite to the materialistic thoughts. Spirituality is the Urdu word used for the spirituality is rohaniyat. It means something which grips us towards the God, which leads us towards the God by forgetting this word, this very word. So spirituality, there is nothing about the profits and loss in the spirituality. There is always a discussion about the God and the creation of the gods, creatures of the gods, and to praise the God in some manners. Being the careful student of science and philosophy, he was deeply impressed by the new discoveries. He doesn't only talk about the spirituality or the non-materialistic thoughts, but he always talk about the science and religion also. So having a firm grip upon the new discoveries and the related knowledge of the new discoveries, he was also modernized poet. He also talked about the modern way also. The modern scientific discoveries were also in his mind. It means that we cannot say either he was an optimistic poet or either he was a pessimistic poet. But he was, above all, he was a poet of the spiritual and the scientific thoughts. So there was always a conflict between science and religion. Doubt and faith, materialism and spirituality in his poetry. So, side by side, conflictive, contrasting, and comparative explanations can be found in his poetry. These informations are related to the science and religion, doubt and faith, materialistic thoughts, and spiritual thoughts. Now we quickly move towards his works. In 1829, he won the Chancellor's Gold Medal for the poem Timbuktu. That was a pictorial depiction at that time, marginalized with the pictorial imagery. The pictures can be seen in this poem because when readers go through the verses of this poem, there are the number of sceneries which passes by before the very eyes of the readers. In 1830, Tennyson published his first solo collection, poems, chiefly lyrical. A lyrical poem is always in the form of song that can be sung through the lyrics on the different types of the melodies. So that was a great achievement for Tennyson that he write the lyrical poems such like the Wordsworth has written the lyrical ballads. And at the end of 1832, he published another volume of poetry, the poems by Alfred Tennyson. Though that was published in 1833, and 1833 doesn't mean that it was written in the 1833, but it was written in 1832. It was completed in 1832, but that was up to the publisher that he has dated this book in 1833. Tennyson published his more poetry in the two volume of poems in 1842, which including the Lady of Shalott, which was revised second time in his book, one of his famous poem in which he talk about a lady and some characteristics of her prettiness in that poem. And also again there is a scientific approach to analyze, and there is side by side a non-materialistic approach to analyze that character. He also written the Locksley Hall, Morte Arthur, and Ulysses, which ends with the well-known line, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield, which means that the poet wanna talk about the spirituality. Spirituality is always to strive, not to eat so much, eat according to the necessity and needs, to seek in the skies, to find out the truth of this universe, and to find, not to yield. But it is nothingness again for the poet, because poet does know that any materialistic thing cannot decide either in the day of judgment how we will stand before the God. So that's why he focuses upon the spirituality to go through with his subject matters. And now we continue with his works. The Princes was written in 1847. That is a long narrative poem. It was his notable work, but the his career best poem, which always was beneficial for Tennyson and made him famous, was In Memoriam, which was written in 1850. The purpose to write In Memoriam was there was a friend of Tennyson. His name was Hallam, and he was died of hemorrhage in the years before 1850. That's why he write down this long narrative poem In Memoriam only in one single purpose, that it is an elegy to mourn upon his good friend Hallam's death due to hemorrhage. He married with Emily Selwood in 1850 AD, and it was at that point of his career when he was appointed as a poet laureate by Queen Victoria in 1850. Who is a poet laureate? Basically, a poet laureate is a poet of a state of United Kingdom. He has some basic duties to write the poetry at state level, to analyze the poetry at state level, to fulfill the political requirements of the government and the officials, to write the debate speeches for the government officials. So that is some kind of duty for the poet laureate. Is totally a government servant. Tennyson's Demeter and other poems, 1889, were published, contain the work that addresses the devastating loss of his son Lionel. Tennyson and his son Lionel were on a voyage at a ship. They were on a voyage of India, where on the ship his son Lionel was died, and Tennyson has written an elegy, Demeter, and other poems in 1889 only to mourn about the death of Lionel because Lionel was very important for Tennyson. Of course, any father could be uh, more than deeper, having deeper affections for his own son. So well-known works of the Tennyson includes the Locksley Hall, the Prince's Idylls of King, Tears, Idle Tear. Yes, one of the most famous poems, Crossing the Bar. Crossing the Bar is actually such like that. Nowadays we can see from the Robert Frost, the Mending Walls. But he's a modern poet, but Tennyson was early Victorian poet, so that's why he has written the Crossing the Bars in a totally comparative analysis with the materialism and non-materialism, between the materialistic thoughts and between the spirituality, non-materialistic thoughts. And after that he written the more than other poems, the Lotus Eaters, one of the most important poems, the Miller's Daughter, the Lady of Shalott, and Queen Mary. Queen Mary was basically a poetical drama which was performed off the stage at that time. And at last the break, break, break on the cold grey stones, O sea, his first elegy for his friend In Memoriam, as I have mentioned earlier, his friend Hallam. Oh, a poet having a great career was died, alas. That was a moment of big loss for the English literature, but he was suffering from gout and it was becoming intense, and he experienced a recurrence that grew worse and worse with the passage of time, and in the late summer of 1892 he was on the deathbed. Later that year, on October 6 at the age of 83, In the late summer of 1892, Tennyson was passed away, and at his Aldworth home in Surrey, which is a county of England. He was buried in Westminster's Abbey in Poets' Corner, where the other poets are also buried. The most famous poets are also buried, and of course, there is no doubt that he was one of the greatest poets. I have mentioned some quotes of the Tennyson: to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. I have explained to you earlier that it always deals towards the spirituality. There is not to make reply, there's is not to reason why, there is but to do and die. It means that Tennyson is gonna explain us the purpose of our creation in this world is that only we are here to do something or to die. And we are here to fulfill some specific purpose, and after that purpose, after the fulfillment of that purpose, we are going to die, all of the human beings and also the creatures created by the Lord. Other quotation is third one, that if I had a flower for every time I thought of you, I could walk in my garden forever. That having a flower in my hand and thinking about you, I could walk in my garden for many and many a time, for a number of hours, for and forever. I can walk in that garden thinking about you forever and ever. And the other quotation is that I'm a part of all that I have met. It is again the negation to the materialism. It is again a spirituality, that concept of nature, which concept of nature was presented by William Wordsworth. Same concept of nature, that nature is all around the surrounding. Nature is a nurse. Nature is a soothing agent. Nature is what we thought about. It is always about the thinking, about the thoughts of a particular person. Nature, red in tooth and claw, is deliberately discusses the cruel nature, the cruel parts of the nature. 'Tis not too late to seek a newer world, that no doubt that we are not late to see the new world. And into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell rode the 600. He discusses that every single creature who is in this world is always has to face the death. Death is the ultimate truth of this world, and we cannot survive without facing it. So thanks to you all. Hope that you have understand the today's discussion and the lecture. If there is some kind of question, you can ask to me in the comments box. And in next lecture, we will be discussing Arnold and Browning and some minor poets of early Victorian age. So that's it from today's lecture. Hope that you have enjoyed this lecture, and you have understand all the particular informations given in this lecture. Hope for the best. Thanks a lot. Allah Hafiz.